This is a Hwasong-17 ICBM being tested in March 2023, a missile that North Korea claims can deliver a nuclear warhead to any location in the United States. While this might be good news for Kim Jong-un, it's bad news for you. Well, yeah, that's right. You're now the President of the United States. Congrats on the promotion. This guy, and the country he leads, is a problem. It builds and fires missiles, threatens its neighbors, hacks targets abroad, and starves its children. And so unlike the 13 presidents before you, you decide to solve this problem once and for all. In theory, a fight between the US and North Korea is no contest. The US possesses weapons like the F-35 and the M1 Abrams, while North Korea is equipped with J-7s and T-55s, which were cutting edge around the same time that my dad still had a full set of hair. But the truth is, an invasion could end in disaster. In fact, in a recent Pentagon study, it estimated that even without nuclear weapons, a war against North Korea could mean 20,000 South Korean civilians dying every single day. But why is this? How can a tiny country with this leader be so hard to invade? And if you were to invade, could you avoid it ending in World War III?
North Korea test firing another ballistic missile.
Again, firing another missile.
There is no problem more in need of a solution. No crisis more urgent.
Okay, Mr. President, let's get going and look at our options. So why not just let the Air Force sort this one out, rather than risking the ground forces? Well, if you remember your history, you'd remember that the US already tried that option back in Korea during the 1950s, and then again in Vietnam, and then again in Afghanistan, with the campaign in the previous Korean War destroying pretty much every building over 2 stories anywhere in North Korea. In fact, these days it has even less chance of working, as the DPRK possesses a wide network of tunnels and bunkers throughout the major centers and the DMZ, some capable of housing 2,000 soldiers each for months at a time, and beyond the reach of most of the munitions the US uses. As whilst the US does have a pretty impressive arsenal of bunker busters like the GBU-37 and GBU-57, they only have penetration of up to 200 feet, making them obsolete against bunkers dug into large mountains, which many of the DPRKs are. And while an air power only strategy would allow you to hit targets that are well known and above ground, like the nuclear research facilities at Yongbyon, there's also very little chance you'd be able to hit all of your key targets, like missile sites and command centers. And that's even if you knew where they all were. And if the aim was to prevent the DPRK from firing its missiles, well, their mobile launchers can be quickly driven out of their safe tunnels, set up and fired well before you'd be able to scramble planes to respond. So, okay, the bombers alone don't work. Time to look at another option. To actually eliminate the North Korean threat once and for all, you're going to have to actually conquer and occupy the country. However, if you spend more than 2 seconds looking at a topographic map of the peninsula, you're quickly going to realize that invading North Korea is going to be far more difficult than something like Iraq was. Now, as you can see, driving straight across the DMZ, to put it mildly, is a bit of a nightmare. The DMZ sector contains millions of landmines, 13,000 plus artillery pieces, Scud missiles, tanks, surface-to-air missiles, bunkers, tunnels, and an estimated 750,000 North Korean soldiers, all concentrated along this 148-mile frontier. And even if we achieve a breakout here, we'll have to deal with another 550,000 North Korean troops stationed throughout the rest of the country. And although it is hard to make a definitive call on the morale of the soldiers who'll be doing this fighting, as previous wars, or even current ones show us, when it's your country being invaded, you tend to be willing to fight a lot harder. Now admittedly, most of these will be conscripts, but because of that, they would have all had around 5 years of military training, so we can assume that most of them will be likely able to shoot with some semblance of accuracy, especially if we compare them to who we were fighting in Afghanistan or Vietnam. Now, these conscripts will probably be fairly poorly equipped, and the US will likely have a massive advantage in equipment and technology going into the conflict. But so did Russia when they carried out their offensive in 2022, until outside nations began sending equipment to help even the odds in Ukraine. And as Xi himself has confirmed, if the US were to begin moving assets into the peninsula in preparation for an invasion of North Korea, China and probably Russia likely wouldn't hesitate to donate some of their most unfriendly items for the North Koreans to use. Conducting an offensive here also means we're going to have to take into account the chemical and biological units stationed here along the front line. Concentrating your troops along a narrow front means we have better concentration and we're more likely to break through the enemy lines. But by concentrating our formations, we're also more likely to succumb to chemical and biological weapons attacks, putting our formations at great risk. And while yes, I'm the first to acknowledge the US and South Korean forces have a massive advantage in technology, they're also still pushing up against entrenched and fortified positions, designed and improved over nearly 80 years to repel this exact form of attack. In fact, these studies done on the reality of carrying out this scenario estimate that the US would suffer tens of thousands of casualties for each day of offensive action. It would be a Vietnam War worth of casualties every 2 days, with the offensive expected to take weeks or even months to achieve the necessary breakout. So we're not saying the US and South Korea couldn't successfully cross the DMZ and keep pushing. What we're saying is the price tag for doing so would be astronomical. So let's look at some of the other options open to you. Once we gain control of the air and sea, we might want to try for a naval invasion, landing behind the perilous DMZ, avoiding that entire death nest, and then driving straight into Pyongyang. Bruce Springsteen and Budweiser in Pyongyang by Christmas.
Get some!
Well, lucky for you, the east coast of North Korea is far less defended than the DMZ or the west coast, and it does allow you to more easily bring up your units from the bases in Japan and the US west coast. But the trouble is where to land those troops. While North Korea has around 400 miles of eastern coastline to choose from, there are, in reality, only a few actually viable options, and here in Hamhung quickly becomes our obvious landing spot. It's one of the few places on the North Korean east coast that has the right depth of water, a decent gap between the shore and the mountains to form a defensive perimeter, enough flat ground to land helicopters or possible airdrops. That, and it's also closer to more of the airfields in Japan. But seeing as how their ally China has numerous satellites and aerial surveillance assets, there's pretty little chance of us pulling off this invasion by surprise like we did in the 1950s, as the hills, caves and mountains overlooking the landing beaches are almost certainly going to be packed with all sorts of nasty goodies, some of which was likely donated by Beijing and Moscow, with the express goal of making our stay here less than ideal. The US has landed on contested beaches before, so it is still well within their capacity to be able to take Hamhung and establish a beachhead. But that's when the real problems actually start. Supply, as any military planner will tell you, is the most important aspect of planning any operation, particularly an amphibious one, as once a Marine or paratrooper blows through his ammunition in the first or second firefight, he becomes little more than just a poorly dressed tourist. This, by the way, is also why launching paratroopers into the middle of North Korea won't actually work, as whilst they may be able to take some ground, without an overland supply chain or numerous flat drop zones to land equipment in, those airborne troops will only be able to hold ground until they've either run out of ammunition or the North Korean heavy tanks begin to arrive. Now, Marine planners suggest that each brigade requires a minimum 1,000 to 2,000 tons of supply per day, far higher than that as well if we want to be bringing any sort of heavy vehicles, tanks or logistical equipment along with us, and even more on top of that if we're going to go on the offensive. As whilst an army like Russia can expect to be able to supplement their supply lines for food by raiding supermarkets in the territory they occupy in Ukraine, being in North Korea, we won't have access to any of that. In fact, there's a high chance there may not even be electricity in much of the country we're about to occupy, forcing us to bring even basics like power generation with us on top of everything else. And when you start to account for the lack of port facilities here in North Korea, it means that we can either keep a very small force kind of supplied, or a large force not supplied at all. And even if we were to solve this issue, Pyongyang is still a 200-mile march from Hamhung, through jagged and narrow mountain passes, which, as Afghanistan and Chechnya has taught us, is an environment where armored columns are very susceptible to ambushes. And with there only being a few paths through the mountains, the reality is we're more than likely going to spend the whole march watching our supply lines and vehicles being picked off one by soldiers hiding in bunkers speckled throughout the mountains, making any progress down this road slow and incredibly costly, and all of which will be occurring far before the remaining troops get anywhere near Pyongyang. So the East Coast isn't looking great, the facilities suck, and the distance is horrible. So what about a landing on the West Coast? After all, Nampo, here, has a slightly bigger port you can capture, and it's only 40 miles from Pyongyang. Well, even if we do land and capture Nampo, we're going to hit that same supply problem again, as once again getting our 2,000 tons of supplies ashore per day is going to mean either upgrading the Nampo port or requiring an amount of US transport planes that would be very difficult to maintain for any prolonged length of time. However, there's another problem with the west coast. Whilst on the east coast, your support ships and carriers can operate far out to sea, out of range of most of the North Korean missile batteries. This option here on the west coast would require you to place your entire fleet and its supporting elements well within range of North Korean missiles, making your entire fleet a giant sitting duck from attacks coming from not only North Korea, but also China if they chose to get involved. Even if you did convince your naval chiefs that the risk would be worth it, the west coast also contains a lot more of North Korea's more adequately equipped units. And even if we were to start bringing in tanks immediately to prevent the enemy from barraging us with their armor, it's unlikely to be enough with that supply bottleneck still there, which, with limited capacity for bringing supply ashore, means we'll be likely forced to prioritize fuel and shells over food and medicine. The Marines carrying out this invasion may be great fighters and outclass the North Koreans man to man, but in the end, it'll be the logistics that decide how long they'll actually be able to fight for. And as you can see, this is obviously a highly risky plan. There's still a few options left on the table. So I can hear you saying to yourself, okay, well, if Kim and his nuclear weapons are the problem, why don't we cancel this invasion and just send in a special forces team and get rid of just him? Well, here's the problem. Knocking out Kim wouldn't give us democracy in North Korea, but just another North Korean leader. By eliminating Kim, we could just as likely end up with one of the high-ranking DPRK generals in charge of the country, a faction of which regularly advocate for launching first strikes against South Korea. So with this option, there's a significant chance we would simply be trading bad for worse. And on top of all of this, the problem with any of these plans is the potential for escalation. So just for a moment, imagine we do pull all of this off, and we successfully break through the lines of the DMZ, and or carry out some successful naval invasions, and our tanks are now barreling toward Pyongyang.
Oh, it's gonna be dark soon.
However, being this close to the capital brings up the use it or lose it problem. You see, right now, Kim knows that if he pushes the big red button and launches his nuclear weapons, the US will swiftly retaliate, probably significantly shortening his life expectancy. So he doesn't. But if the US forces are approaching the entrance to his bunker, and he feels like he's done for anyway, well, then he has nothing to lose, and likely pushes the button. And while we may intercept some of the missiles, there is very little chance we're intercepting all of them. Then there's the issue of Chinese intervention. Now, back in 1950, when North Korea was being rolled back by the UN forces, the Chinese sent 1 million volunteers into North Korea to fight, many of which never came home. And whilst that would still be an option for Beijing today, a far more likely strategy for Beijing would be to instead send in peacekeepers. Xi would be making the calculation that even if it meant removing Kim Jong-un themselves, pushing these men across the Yalu River to establish a new line of Chinese troops across the peninsula would likely blunt the US advance, as when the US forces inevitably reach that line, they really only have one of two bad choices. Option 1 would be to continue their pursuit of North Korean forces and fire upon the Chinese, effectively starting World War III, or 2, stop the US advance there, and accept that even after they likely lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers and the South Korean state is in ruin, that this entire war simply moved the border between North and South Korea slightly northward, to either expand the war with you firing the first shots, or walk away, trading all of those lives for a slightly closer front line, and probably an even more awkward mission accomplished banner. Okay, so with all these options as non-starters, it's time to get serious. Yes, it's time to talk about using the nuclear option. The idea is to knock out North Korea as quick as possible, before they ever get the chance to strike you. And you're in luck, as the US does have a much larger nuclear arsenal, with the US possessing around 5,200 warheads, compared to North Korea having between 40 to 180, but sources I trust tend to put it around the 55 mark. The US also has far more ways to deliver those warheads, with missiles from planes, from submarines, or missiles launched from the US, as well as a few other covert methods. Now, put aside for a second that we would be actively launching a war crime here, and realize that if we did decide to launch this as a first strike, the entire world would likely throw some serious condemnation toward the US.
Are you saying boo or boo-earns?
I was saying boo-earns.
This option also all but guarantees that the North Koreans will immediately launch their missiles as well, and it's unlikely that we will be able to intercept all of theirs, with some estimates suggesting we may only intercept as little as 57% of the missiles that North Korea fires, leaving them more than enough to throw a very nasty punch back, hitting targets all across Japan, South Korea, and possibly the US. So our plan to prevent nuclear war by starting a nuclear war may not have been the most well thought out one.
Did it, Patrick! We saved the city!
So we have 6 options on the table, and none of them actually eliminate the threat posed by North Korea. And sadly, there seems little to do but just maintain the current status quo, as unless Kim changes his mind or the country changes course, there's very little the rest of us could do without paying a frankly outrageous cost. And seeing as it's North Korea we're talking about here, I would argue that it's probably not the best return on investment. No easy solutions for you, Mr. President. But as president, you might have another problem a little closer to home: a military coup within the United States. And to find out more about that, watch this video to understand how a dictator could use the existing levers of government to seize power in the US.